And now we are going to our next keynote speaker, Anil Seth, who's a professor in cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex. In addition, he serves as editor-in-chief of Neuroscience of Consciousness, a journal, co-director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science, and member of the Advisory Council and Steering Committee for the Human Mind Project. He has published numerous books and countless articles, with the most recent book being You, A New Science of Consciousness, which was featured in the Sunday Times Top 10 bestsellers list. I read the book myself, and it was breathtaking, so I cannot recommend it more. His 2017 Mainstage TED presentation has more than 13 million views. Your brain hallucinates the reality, I think, is the title of that. And is one of TED's most popular science talks. Without further ado, I introduce you Anil Seth.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful venue. It's actually my second time in Bucharest. I was here just in October last year for this festival called Unfinished. I don't know how many people know about or been to that, but I thought it was brilliant. I really loved it. So if you haven't heard of Unfinished and you live in Bucharest, I recommend you look that up straight away. So thank you to the organizers for bringing me here again. It's a great pleasure. My whole talk is on this slide. So you can just look at this, and then we'll have some questions. I'll unpack it a little bit. This talk, I'm going to try to make it a little bit more general. There are kind of detailed studies behind, and we can talk about those later, but I want to try and get the big picture across in the next 40 minutes. And today, we're going to talk about consciousness. We've already heard some great speakers this morning on the topic of consciousness. And I think one thing may have become apparent already is that it's a very hard concept to define. We've heard many different definitions already. And this is true. There's no real consensus definition, either in science or in philosophy, about what consciousness is. Intuitively, though, we all know what consciousness is. It's what we lose when we fall into a dreamless sleep or go under general anesthesia. It's what returns when we wake up again or come round again after the operation. And when we are conscious, we're conscious of things. There's a felt quality to the nature of our minds. There's a redness to red, a painness to pain, a sharpness to jealousy or touch. We are more than mere biological objects. There's a whole experiential dimension. That's intuitively what consciousness means. It's very hard to pin it down more precisely. Perhaps the one definition I quite like is this one from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. Had a few references to his work already. An organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. And what he's driving at here, I think, is that it feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be each one of you. But it doesn't feel like anything to be this podium or that screen or even the laptop computer, though some people might disagree about that. For these things, there is no inner life. There's no experiential flip side. They are just objects, even if they're complicated objects. Nagel's paper was famously about a bat. What is it like to be a bat? And none of us can ever know what it's like to really be a bat, but the point is there's something for the bat that it's like to be a bat. Now, this definition's I think useful partly because of what it doesn't include. Consciousness is not the same thing as intelligence. It's not the same thing as having language. It's not the same thing as having this explicit sense of personal identity. It's just the presence of any kind of experience whatsoever. And with that in mind, we face the question that I think certainly Danko or Georg made reference to, the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that this biological wetware was it the gruesome something or other inside our skulls? How does this give rise to any kind of experience whatsoever? This is David Chalmers. Of course, we've seen him before. And he is probably the most famous reference point for articulating this problem. It is, of course, a problem that goes way, way back in history. But he put it like this. He said, why should physical processing stuff happening in brains and bodies? Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does. Faced with this apparently intractable problem, how could any explanation in terms of neurons, or even gated neurons, or even temporal synchrony, or something else among neurons, how could any explanation in those terms explain, like, aha, that's why consciousness happens? Faced with this apparently intractable mystery, there's a temptation to reach for rather radical solutions. And in philosophy, at any rate, there are at least two of these. One of them is called panpsychism, which is getting oddly more popular these days. This is the idea that consciousness is fundamental and ubiquitous, that it's somehow everywhere and in everything. It's part of the nature of the universe, much as energy, mass, charge, these things are. Of course, if consciousness is everywhere from the beginning, you don't have to explain how it comes about. So it's job done. The problem with panpsychism, at least for me, is that it doesn't explain anything, you can't test it, it doesn't generate anything that's testable, and it doesn't really do much work. So I don't really like panpsychism. The other alternative is called in philosophy illusionism. This is a more interesting idea, I think. This is the idea that consciousness doesn't really exist, at least not how we normally think of it. And the bit in brackets is important. Some people seem to say that consciousness we're just mistaken that there's a problem here at all. Now, if we learn to think about experience differently, we'd realize that in fact we are just objects, and that's all. This seems odd because it denies what I think is the most central phenomenon of our lives and of our minds, the fact that consciousness is real. But it may not be what we think it is, and this I think is useful. We might think that consciousness is some kind of inner movie being observed by a little mini-me inside my head, and there might be some kind of mental paint inside my head that is red or that is green, qualia, as it's called in philosophy. This might be not the right way to think about it. So I'm sort of tempted by this view, but I don't buy the full, like, consciousness doesn't exist Kool-Aid. So the approach, and we've heard a number of different approaches, and I think it's important, it's an interesting part of today that we can contrast and compare some different approaches that are all broadly within the approach of neuroscience, of understanding the brain in terms of its biology. My favorite take is called the real problem of consciousness, which I've called it that slightly to annoy David Chalmers, because the hard problem. And the idea of the real problem, I'm just going to put it up and unpack it a bit. It's the question of how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness. Explain, predict, and control. That's what scientific explanations in general do. They help us understand why a phenomenon is the way it is and not another way. They help us predict when it might happen, and we can control it. They don't always have to explain why something exists in the first place. That's asking quite a lot. Physics has shed enormous light on how the universe works, but it hasn't told us why it exists in the first place. So this idea of explaining, predicting properties of consciousness can be what we do in virtue of being conscious, or it can be what we experience. My experience of vision is different from my experience of emotion. These are properties too, and that's where I'm going to focus. This is different from the hard problem because I'm not trying to explain how consciousness comes to be part of the universe. It's not also what Chalmers called the easy problem, which is the problem of understanding how the brain works, but sweeping consciousness away out of sight under the carpet. And the hope is that by following this trajectory, and I'm going to give you some examples of this process, like what it really means, is that the hard problem of consciousness, this apparently intractable mystery, it's not going to be solved head-on as if it's one big scary mystery and there's going to be one eureka solution. Rather, it's going to be dissolved over time. And we will look back, we hope, and think, oh, yeah, now we do actually understand how consciousness fits into our picture of biology, of physics, of the natural world in general. There is a precedent for this. It's not perfect, but it's a useful thing to think about, which is how our understanding of life has evolved over the last couple of centuries. It wasn't that long ago, maybe 100, 150 years ago, surprisingly recently, that some people thought that life could not be explained in terms of physics or chemistry, that there had to be something almost supernatural, immaterial, a spark of life, a divine spark, an élan vital, to explain the difference between the living and the non-living. Now, today, we don't understand everything about life, but there's no longer this sense that it's beyond the reach of science. And this happened not because biologists found the spark of life or proved that life doesn't exist. What they did was they said, well, life has a number of properties like metabolism, homeostasis, reproduction. Let's explain each of those, and bit by bit, the apparently hard problem of life faded away. And looking back, it seems like, well, there was no need to think about a spark of life at all. Now, I can't guarantee the same thing will happen with consciousness, but it might. And the hope is by following this trajectory, we'll end up looking back at consciousness the same way. Now, there is an obvious difference, which I want to just point out between consciousness research and biology, which is that if you're trying to figure out how living systems work, you can actually put a frog on a table. This is how biology works. You put a frog on a table, and you look at it, and you can share the data about it. That's easily done, more or less. People looking at a frog, biology. In consciousness research, you can't really do that. You can't put a conscious experience on the table and look at it. Like, I know my own experience to some extent, but none of you really do. Better for you. And that's a problem, because the data are private, subjective. They have to be accessed indirectly by people explaining what they experience and other methods. Some people have said this means a science of consciousness cannot be done. I disagree. I think, in fact, the whole history of psychology is based on indirect reports of what we experience. It just means it's a bit harder. Okay, so that's the overall approach. Now, what are the properties of consciousness? How do we cut this cake? There are many ways to do it, and the way I prefer to do it is just pragmatically, really. 3 different aspects of consciousness. There's conscious level, how conscious you are at any particular moment, the difference between being wide awake or completely asleep or in this kind of post-lunch drowsy dip, which I hope we're trying to crawl out of. There's a global kind of conscious level. Then when you are conscious, there's conscious content. What are you conscious of when you are conscious? The sights, the sounds, the smells, the thoughts, the emotions, the beliefs that populate our conscious experience at any one time. And then, as Georg was saying, an important part of conscious content is the experience of self, the experience of being the individual that you are. How do we account for the specific experience of being you or being me? So today, I don't have time to talk about conscious level. In my group, we work on all of these different aspects of consciousness, but I'm going to talk about content and then a little bit about self. And we'll start with content. And the basic idea here, again, was mentioned earlier, that will explain how and why we experience things the way we do, is that the brain is a kind of prediction machine, and that what we see, what we hear, what we feel are nothing more than the brain's best guesses of what's out there in the world or what's in here in the body. That's the basic idea. And it's an idea with a very long history. You can go back as far as you like. I like to go back at least to ancient Greece and Plato's allegory of the cave. In this allegory, famous allegory, there are a bunch of prisoners and they're trapped to the wall of a cave. And all they can see are shadows cast by the firelight from a fire in the cave on the walls. And they take the shadows to be real because that's all the prisoners have access to. So much so that when one prisoner escapes and goes out and sees there's a vast world beyond the cave and comes back to tell the other prisoners, they want to kill him because it's like that's too disruptive to how they think things really are. So I hope you don't do that to me. At the end of this talk, run away. That's the allegory of the cave. Now, updating this allegory of the cave to the here and now. Instead of prisoners trapped in a cave, think about your brain trapped inside the bony vault of your skull. Now, it's dark in there. It's silent. There's no sound. There's no light inside the skull. All you've got to go on as a brain, trying to figure out what's out there in the world, are electrical signals, which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be, objects of different kinds, other people's thoughts, for instance. All the brain has to go on are electrical signals which are not labeled. They don't come with labels like, I'm from a cat, I'm from a coffee cup, I'm green, or I'm red. just electrical signals. How does the brain make sense of these in order to figure out what's going on? Well, the idea here is the way the brain does this is by combining these ambiguous electrical signals with its prior knowledge or expectations about what's happening. And what we experience is the brain's best guess of what's happening based on combining its prior expectations with the sensory data. So the brain doesn't see light or hear sound. What we experience is the brain's best guess about the causes of the sensory signals that it gets through the eyes, through the ears, from inside the body too. Now, there's many examples of how the brain's predictions really can change what we consciously experience. And I'll give you a couple of them, but I just wanted to say the stronger claim, and it's harder to test, is not merely that the brain's expectations shape what we experience. It's that they are what we experience. And that's an important little flip in the way we think about things. Now, because it seems to us that we soak in the world in a kind of outside-in direction through the transparent windows of our eyes and our ears. But the idea here is that's the wrong way around. Even though it seems like we read the world, it's more a process of writing than reading. The brain is always throwing predictions out into the world and seeing where they land, and that's what we experience. So here's a couple of examples anyway. Now, I'm always interested. How many people have seen Adelson's checkerboard? A few? Not so many. Okay, good. I like it when there's not so many. So these two patches, A and B, hopefully they should look to be different shades of gray. Is that right? Hands up if they look different shades of gray. Okay, there's some hands. But of course, this is an illusion. They are not different shades of gray. They're exactly the same shade of gray, which I can show you just by joining up the two squares there. And you can see it's exactly the same shade of gray. If you think I'm tricking you, I'll just move. Is it still working? Yeah, I'll move one bar across, and you can see it's really the same shade of gray. No trickery. Take the bar away. They look different again. Now, what's happening here is that the brain has knowledge built into the visual cortex that objects under shadow appear darker than they really are. And combine that with how checkerboards generally work, where things are lighter and darker in alternation. And the brain's best guess of what's going on is that it's a checkerboard, and so we see B as lighter than it really is. This is not a failure of the brain. The brain is not a light meter. It's not true. That's why photography is hard. The brain is not a light meter. It's trying to figure out what's going on. So it's called an illusion, but I actually think it really demonstrates how amazingly flexible, adaptable our brains are to this task of perception. Another example, hollow face illusion or hollow mask illusion. How many people have seen this one? More, I think. Okay, well, not everybody, though. So I love this one because it demonstrates something about how deeply baked in the brain's expectations are. So it's a face, and it's rotating. Now, faces are very, very important objects for brains. We're social animals. There's a lot riding on our ability to recognize faces and facial expressions. And the face detection circuitry in our brains has evolved over many, many millennia, and every face that your brain and your ancestors' brain has ever seen has always pointed outwards. So the brain has a very strong prior prediction, expectation that faces point outwards, so that when it sees an inward-pointing face, like in this hollow mask, it would rather reach the conclusion that there's a face rotating in two different directions at once than see an inward-pointing face. And you can see that at the moment of transition, it appears to be rotating in two different directions at once, just around there. It's kind of weird. It works better with a real mask because the eyes follow you around when it's in its inverted state. So the brain's expectations we can just show are quite important. Now, the general idea for what's going on here, this is the only equation I'm going to show you, is that there's something like Bayesian inference going on. There's a framework here for Thomas Bayes, who was a very famous mathematician, philosopher, writer, do what you will, reverend. And he came up with a general framework for how we should, or anything should, reason under conditions of uncertainty. And this is why we talk about priors and best guesses and so on. So the basic idea is very simple, that The Bayes rule gives you a rule for saying, what should I believe next, given what I believe now, and what new information I'm getting. And the I here is the brain itself. So the idea is if the brain believes something very strongly, and then it gets some new data, then it shifts what it believes is going on a little bit. It doesn't immediately leap to the new data in this case because the new data is kind of unreliable. The curve is flatter. So this is the optimal thing brains should do, or anything should do, when faced with this kind of problem. It's the same problem faced by if you're trying to figure out the likelihood you've got a nasty disease when you get a positive test, but the disease is rare. Even a positive result isn't very informative if the disease is really rare and the test is not 100% reliable. So it's the same kind of problem. Now, the first person who suggested, or one of the first people to suggest that this is what the brain is actually doing, was Hermann von Helmholtz. I recently learned he seemed to have stolen this from Arthur Schopenhauer, but there you go. Hermann von Helmholtz was a German physiologist and physicist in the 19th century, proposing that perception is the brain doing unconscious inference. Inference, this process of figuring out the causes of things. And importantly, he called it unconscious inference because the brain isn't aware that it's doing this, and neither are you. You're just aware of the result of this process. Now, thinking about things this way really changes how we think about consciousness. Conscious perception. Normally, as I mentioned a minute ago, we tend to think of it as a kind of outside-in process. This is a sort of classic image from the kind of textbook that certainly I saw 30 years ago when I was a student. And in this classic view, sensory information comes in through the eyes, the retina, and it gets deeper and deeper into the brain, and it's read out at different levels. And there might be some top-down modulation, but basically perception is this outside-in, bottom-up process. Now, the predictive brain view changes this almost entirely. In the predictive brain view, perceptual content is conveyed by these top-down predictions, and the sensory signals convey what we call prediction errors. What sensory signals are doing is telling the brain the difference between what it expects and what it gets at every moment and at every level of processing in the brain. And by minimizing prediction errors everywhere and all the time, by updating predictions or by making movements, the predictions settle on the best guess. It's a way of approximating or implementing Bayesian inference. So brains that do this, that keep throwing out predictions and using sensory signals to update them, are doing this kind of Bayesian inference. And the core claim here is that what we experience is not a readout of the sensory prediction errors, it's the content of the predictions. It's coming from the inside out, the top down. We actively generate our worlds, we don't passively perceive them. Like that. So, little sidebar for sort of people more in the field here, that this is called in general, this is called predictive processing as a general theory in cognitive science. And I wanted to just emphasize to those in the area that I don't think predictive processing is a theory of consciousness. I think it's a general theory of perception, of action, of how brains do what they do. But it can be used, as I'm going to illustrate, to explain properties of consciousness, properties of phenomenology in terms of things happening in brains, in the style of the real problem. We can build bridges between mechanism and what we experience. There is, I think Jörg pointed to it, thank you very much. There was a recent review paper that I wrote with a philosopher called Tim Bain, where we talk about like the most prominent theories of consciousness that are out there in 4 categories: higher order thought, global workspace, integrated information, predictive processing, and we try and explain, in our view, how they relate. And they're all very different, not in terms of, only in terms of what they say is going on, but in terms of the kinds of questions they're trying to answer. But I won't go into details there. I'll move instead, just to give you a flavor for the kind of evidence in the lab that we can collect for this view. This is one simple example. This was a study done a while ago now with a former postdoc of mine, Yair Pinto. And here what we did, we asked what would happen to conscious perception if we manipulated people's expectations in specific ways. So in this experiment, people, in one eye, they see an image, which can either be a house or a face, and it emerges slowly out of darkness. And in the other eye, they see this changing pattern of colored oblongs, which starts high contrast and then disappears into darkness. And we give people a cue, a word, face or house. Now, the cue can either be valid or it can be invalid. Sometimes the image is a face, sometimes it's a house, sometimes the cue is a face, sometimes it's a house. And what we wondered was, if the conscious experience is determined by the brain's expectations, then people should see consciously, more quickly and more accurately, the image when it lines up with the prediction than when it's different from the prediction. And that's what, and across a number of experiments, that's what we find. We find that people see consciously more quickly and more accurately the things they expect to see rather than the things they don't expect to see. So we used to, at least in English, we often say that, I'll believe it when I see it, but it's probably more accurate to say that I'll see it when my brain believes it, turns it around. We recently just extended this, just to show there's still work in this area going on, with Marta Otten, another former postdoc, to ask whether this also applied to memory. And we tend to think of memory as something like quite long ago, but we also have an immediate memory. If you just close your eyes now, the visual image will fade from your awareness, and then you can try and remember what you were just looking at. And it's sort of quite hard to do, but you get a sense that it's there. You can tell me, you can describe what was in your recent past. What we found in another set of experiments, I won't go through the details, was that quite rapidly, this kind of memory of what we've just seen becomes dominated by our expectations. So we remember increasingly what we expected to be the case rather than what we actually perceived at the time, which is kind of important for things like eyewitness testimony and so on. Our memories are even more unreliable than we might think. So moving on to sort of things that these are kind of interesting experiments, but they're a bit boring in a way because it's just like, did you see something or did you remember something? I want to understand more about the nature of the richness of our experience day to day. And so we return to faces here because experiences of faces are very good ways in. We all see faces. We see faces in clouds. We see faces in the arrangements of windows on buildings. Again, the brain is always throwing predictions about faces out there and seeing where they stick. And then when they do, we kind of perceive the shadow, if you like, of a face rather than an actual face. So we took, with other people in my group, we took this idea, and what we wanted to do was build computational models that simulated not what people do, but what they experience. Computation, it's a long word, I wish it wasn't. Computational neurophenomenology, it's the idea. So we started with this neural, this was a few years ago too. This is now a very old-fashioned neural network. It was one of the first of this new wave of AI. This is called AlexNet. What it's very good at is telling you what's in an image. You can give it an image and it'll tell you that there's a dog in it. This is a very bottom-up thing. Activity flows up through the network and it gets to the top and you read it out, dog. But shortly after this algorithm was developed, clever people at Google developed this variant of it called Deep Dream. And what they did here was, instead of giving the image to the network and seeing what the network thought was in it, they fixed the output of the image to, let's say, dog, and then they changed the image. They put activity back through the network and they updated the image until it settled down. Intuitively, this is a bit like a model of throwing a prediction back out at the sensory data and seeing what that might result in. It's a very early way of doing that. And so what we did with Keisuke Suzuki, another postdoc, was we took a panoramic video, 360-degree video of Sussex campus, and we put every frame through this process, and then people would come in and wear a headset, and they could look around. And so this was a model of what a kind of weirdly altered conscious experience would be like if the brain were making very strong predictions to see dogs everywhere. And you can see there's more dogs than you would normally find on Sussex campus in this movie. It's kind of fun to do, but the point is really not any particular data point, but that you can use this method to really simulate experience. It's a way of getting at this relation between what might be happening in the brain and what might be happening in people's experience. What we're doing now is taking this work on to more specifically try to model different kinds of visual hallucination. So there are many kinds of visual hallucinations. Some people in Parkinson's disease have hallucinations of complex objects, complex people and scenes happening that are spontaneous. People with visual loss in Charles Bonnet syndrome have other kinds of visual hallucinations which can be simpler, more geometric, and psychedelic hallucinations are different again. Again, quite geometric, but they see often transformations of what's already out there in the environment. So we now have a different kind of neural network. This is with Keisuke Suzuki, David Schwartz, and Alec Chance. And we're modeling these different kinds of experiences. And this is just an example. We start with various images, and they all get transformed in different ways, and then we can go back to people who have lived experience of these hallucinations and ask them how representative it was. And the reason I mention this is because it's kind of closing the loop. We're getting a handle here on what in the brain is responsible for a particular kind of altered experience, and then that helps us understand perception in the here and now as well. Okay. So the overall message from this part of the talk is that we can think about hallucination, like I've just shown you, as a kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's best guesses lose their grip on the world. And by the same token, perception in the here and now, we can think of as a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination, in which the brain's predictions are always geared to, tied to their causes in the world. And we actively generate our worlds, we don't passively perceive them. Okay, so in the last bit of the talk, let me just move on to the self and talk a little bit about how this applies to the self. So there's maybe an appealing initial way to think about the self, which is that there's a world out there, the brain does some perceiving of it, the self is the thing inside the brain that gets all these perceptions and figures out what to do, then does something and changes the world. We sense, we think, we act. That's how things seem, but how things seem is not how they are. And I think a much richer way to think about the self, and it's not a new way, it goes back in Buddhism certainly thousands of years, is that both the world and the self are forms of perception. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a perception too, or rather a collection of perceptions. And to understand this, the first thing to realize is that when you think about what it means to be you or be me, there's actually many aspects of being a self. There's the experience of the body, of being a body, and of possessing this object in the world. This is my body, and that isn't. There's the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person perspective. There's the experience of intending to do something, being the cause of actions, free will, that came up in the last Q&A. Then there's the experience of personal identity, the aspect of self that you associate with a name and a set of memories of the past and plans for the future, the narrative and the social self. All of these, I think, can be understood as kinds of perceptual predictions, but I'm going to just focus on the bodily self, and the idea, again, is the brain does not have direct access to the body. It's locked up there in the skull, so the brain has to make its best guess about what is and what is not the body on the basis of sensory signals and prior predictions. But now, these sensory signals come largely from the body itself. There's one classic demonstration of this called the rubber hand illusion. How many people have seen the rubber hand illusion? Quite a few. Okay, I'm going to show you again for those who haven't. The rubber hand illusion is a wonderful demo of how flexible the brain's, or rather our experience of what is and what is not the body can be. Now, in the rubber hand illusion, what happens is, there's a guy here in blue, his real hand is hidden from his own sight. He can't see it, it's behind this cardboard partition. There's a fake rubber hand in front of him, and then the experimenter, this chap in green, takes 2 paintbrushes, and he strokes the hands synchronously, in time with each other. And the idea is, after a while, the guy in blue, his brain is seeing a hand. It knows it's not its real hand, but it looks like a hand. It's roughly where a hand should be. He's feeling touch, because his real hand is being touched, and he's seeing the fake hand being touched too. So the brain's conclusion is like, more or less, well, it's not my hand, but it kind of is, because the evidence lines up. And so you have this slightly uncanny experience that you identify a little bit with the fake hand. And this is what it looks like in practice. There are a number of different ways you can test whether it's working, but there's one way of testing it which is by far the most fun, which is to do that. And you can see he's really reacting to that. Now, the standard story told about the rubber hand illusion is that it's this multi-sensory integration. The brain is putting together visual signals and tactile signals to determine what is and what is not the body. In the last few years, though, another of my colleagues in the lab, Pete Lush, noticed there was actually a large variation in how strongly people experienced this illusion. And he suspected it might have less to do with multisensory integration in the brain and more to do with, in psychology, what we call demand characteristics. That is, an overall expectation about what you should experience. If you think about it, you're getting people into a situation, there's a strong implicit encouragement to experience the hand, the rubber hand, as yours. And he thought, well, if this is true, then probably the degree to which you experience the rubber hand illusion will correlate with how hypnotizable you are. And we're all hypnotizable to some extent. It's not a problem. It's just a psychological trait. And the idea is if you're more hypnotizable, then just the very context of the experiment is going to make you experience it more strongly. So Pete measured the rubber hand illusion in 353 people, which was quite a heroic experiment. But he also measured how hypnotizable they are, and we did indeed find there's quite a strong correlation. So this has become a little bit, there's some kind of rubber hand wars going on in neuroscience now between us and people who believe it's different. But the main point still is that however it's working, it shows that our experience of what is the body can really change. It can change quite dramatically. We can't take our bodies for granted. The brain is always constructing this aspect of what it is to be a self. That's the body as an object in the outside. But there's also the experience of the body from within, being a beast machine, as I call it, emotions and moods and this basic feeling of just being alive. What's going on here, this experience of being a body? Well, this brings up a whole other aspect of perception, which I'm only going to gesture at, which is called interoception. Interoception is the sensation, perception, and control of the body from within. Blood pressure, heart rate, gastric tension, things like that. And again, the brain does not have direct access to these essential physiological processes that keep us alive. It has to make a best guess about them. And so we have, again, the same dance of this is an idea. Been writing, sort of exploring this for the last 10 years now. We have this dance of prediction and prediction error, but now it's taking place entirely or largely within the body itself through a process of interoceptive inference. And the idea is that, so just as when we experience vision, when our brain is making predictions about things out there in the world, similar idea, interoceptive predictions, when the brain is throwing these predictions at the body, what we experience is, in this case, emotion. That's the content of a prediction about the interior of the body. There's one very important difference between predictions that are about the world and predictions that are about the body, which is that interoceptive predictions about the body from within are about controlling things, not finding things out. The brain doesn't care where the heart is or what color or shape the liver is. It cares about how well it's doing at keeping the body alive, how well it's controlling these things. So the predictions have a very different character. They're about control rather than discovery. And this will be very important. There's a long history to this kind of thinking. I won't talk about it, but if you look back in history, you find cybernetics, this sort of overlooked cousin of modern AI, said something very much like this. This free energy principle from Carl Friston said something very similar as well, in a very complicated way, but it's basically the same idea that the brain essentially is trying to keep the body alive through making predictions that control and regulate the physiology of the body. And what this means is that we're going to have different kinds of experiences. Visual predictions are about the world, cares where things are and how they're moving. Are they coming towards me or away? How do they reflect light? So our visual predictions have a visual kind of character. But interoceptive predictions are all about this control and regulation. So predictions about the body from within are going to have a different character. It's going to be more about emotion, mood, things go well or badly. They have a character of valence. So different kind of prediction, different kind of conscious experience. And if you pull on this thread long enough, and this is what I try to do in the book, don't have the time here, you find that consciousness becomes very intimately related with life. Now, we tend to think of them as maybe a bit separate, that our nature as living machines is just the way our bodies work, and our brains just do their thing. But if you think about why brains evolved, now, they didn't evolve to do neuroscience or music or poetry or even really to move. They evolved to keep the organism alive. And the way to do this is by making predictions. So the whole machinery that underpins our ability to experience anything, in this view, arose in evolution and development through this fundamental biological imperative to stay alive. Consciousness and life become intimately related. This is very different from what René Descartes used to say, and this is a good place to start to wind up. Descartes, as well as inventing the mind-body problem, said about non-human animals that their status as living creatures really didn't matter. He said about non-human animals, without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. He called non-human animals beast machines, bête machine in the French, to make the point they didn't really deserve any moral consideration. And I think almost entirely the opposite, that we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it with, through, and because of our living bodies. We are conscious beast machines, and we're conscious because of and not in spite of our beast machine nature. Okay, let me summarize, and then I'll finish with 2 or 3 very quick implications. So what we experience out there in the world is not a process of reading the world from the outside in. It's a top-down, brain-based, actively generated best guess about what's out there in the world. We actively generate our worlds, we don't passively perceive them. This applies to the body as an object too. It's not to be taken for granted. It's another kind of Bayesian best guess. And again, this also applies to the body from within, but here the predictions the brain are making are more to do with control and regulation rather than figuring out where things are or what shape they are. So we experience moods, emotions instead of objects, people, and places. That's the basic of the story. There's a couple of implications that I'll just finish on. One I think we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is what does this perspective mean for artificial intelligence and the prospects for conscious AI? Well, if I'm on the right track here, then you won't get conscious AI until you have living machines. If consciousness and life are related this way, then before you have conscious AI, you need living AI, and we're not there yet. There's a number of reasons, actually, why we won't get there, and we're going to talk about this more on the panel. But intelligence and consciousness are very different things. That's number one. You don't get consciousness just by being smarter. Number two is, if people try to actually design conscious machines, there's a lot more uncertainty, but I don't think we're anywhere close to it. But it would be a very bad if we actually succeeded for all sorts of reasons. What's more worrying, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, is that machines that even give us the appearance of being conscious, even if they're actually not, are going to be very disruptive to society. Our minds are not well equipped, as we're seeing with these large language models, to interact with systems that we feel are conscious, even though we know they aren't. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here very shortly. Give me one more minute and I'm good. The last thing I wanted to say, is that one last implication of this is that we will each experience the world in a slightly different way. We will have a unique experience, even of a shared objective reality, because our experience comes from the inside out. We see things not as they are, we see things as we are, as Anil Seth said. And yeah, you've probably all seen the dress, black and blue, white and gold, something else? Good, okay. So there is a diversity in perception among us already, but it's happening all the time. It's not just for social media memes like this. So just as we differ on the outside, we differ also on the inside. And here's a little call for help on this. We have a new project called the Perception Census, where we're trying to measure how different our inner worlds are. So you might have got a bookmark, I don't know. If not, just look up the Perception Census or scan this QR code for people who like QR codes. It's a series of little online illusions and interactive experiments and things where we can try to map out for the first time how different we are on the inside in ways that we are otherwise very, very difficult to know about, and to surface this very valuable form of diversity. So we've already had more than 25,000 people from 100 countries, so please join them if you can and make this one of the, well, it's already there, but make it really the biggest citizen science study of perception that there's ever been. So I won't talk about, if you're coming along, by the way, to see me tomorrow, I'll talk about the Dream Machine there, which is where this came from, which is where we took stroboscopic light and we gave 40,000 people visual hallucinations for the fun of it last year in the UK. And these are the Dream Machines, and they drew lovely pictures like this. Whoops, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and this. And those are the people who've helped with all the research. That is the book, and there is now, I'm delighted to say, launching tomorrow a Romanian translation of it, which will be launched at Cărți Carousel tomorrow at 5 p.m. And with that, I will stop and say thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anil, for the amazing talk you've given us. So much food for thought. We will take now one question that was posted in the chat for you, and that is, what is your opinion, given that you want to dissolve the heart problem, what is your opinion of the way integrated information theory tackles it? Do you think is on the right track for explaining consciousness?
I think it's very interesting, and I'll try and explain why very quickly. So integrated information theory, as the main proponent of it, is this very inspirational scientist, Giulio Tononi, who I know you've worked with. Did you put this question in the chat?
No.
You sure?
I'm sure.
So he's
My friends did.
He's really trying to solve the hard problem head on, right? He's trying to say, okay, this is why consciousness is part of the world. And he does it in a very ambitious way. And he tries to say, instead of asking, as most people do, what in the brain gives rise to consciousness, he says, well, what are the properties of consciousness and what must underlie them in general? Like going the other way from consciousness to like the inferences about how any kind of physical system, be it a brain or something else, might be. This is fascinating, but I do worry about it. And I worry about it because in his version of it, it becomes almost impossible to test. It becomes very hard to measure. Maybe I'll be interested to know what you think about this. It becomes almost impossible to test. And also its explanatory power is somehow quite oddly distorted. It's not really talking about the self specifically. It doesn't talk about interactions with the environment particularly. I know this is changing a bit. So it's currently a little bit limited. And it makes a lot of assumptions about just the basic axioms of what's necessary in consciousness. And so I think I've been fascinated by it for 20 years. It's why I first went to San Diego, because I'd read early versions of this, and Tononi had left by the time I got there. But I think there's another way, and the other way is to take the same basic insights that every experience we have is integrated. We experience a single scene, and it's also informative. Like every experience we have is different from every other experience we have had or will have. And there are ways to sort of write down equations that capture those coexistence of those properties and look for the footprints of those equations in the brain. And that's a slightly weaker approach. We're not claiming that it's identical to consciousness, but it has the advantage that you can go ahead and measure it. So this is the approach that me and my colleagues take at Sussex.
I see. That was definitely illuminating. And now, here comes my question, which builds on that. And I want to give you some space to situate your beast machine theory between this pole of what IIT represents in consciousness science and what free energy principle represents for brain structure and function as a macro theory or a macro framework. Because I know in your book, you situated it between these two poles, and you claim it's the way to do progress now.
Yeah.
Can you expand a bit on that?
I'll try to. So the story, as I told it today, is a little bit it's starting with an account of how we might experience the world around us, like thinking about visual perception and so on, motivating this idea of the brain as a prediction machine this way, and then saying, okay, because that's what happened historically, that's the way things started. So the historical trajectory, we think about how we experience the outside world, and then we generalize to like, okay, maybe this is operating inside the body as well. And then you get to this place where actually that's kind of fundamental. The free energy principle starts from the other direction. It basically says, and that even that sentence is rubbish, because the free energy principle doesn't basically say anything, basically. I spent 9 years trying to understand the damn thing, and I still don't. Not fully. But one of the ideas central to the free energy principle is that anything that exists, that persists over time, like even a single cell, must, in virtue of continuing to exist and resisting the second law of thermodynamics and all this stuff, it must kind of induce a boundary between itself and everything else, and can be regarded as modeling perturbations to its environment. Yes. And to continue to exist, you can describe a system as always having to minimize the unexpectedness of its state. And that's just a basic sort of imperative that everything that exists must follow. it gets a bit complicated when you think about, does it do it actively, or is it merely a way of looking at things, and what are the mathematical assumptions exactly? There's a lot of argument there. But the intuition is that prediction then flows from that basic imperative that things like brains, like cells, like bodies exist over time and actively resist the second law. And so then you've got like a first principles way to think about, that's why complex brains have this kind of predictive architecture. And so then you generalize from that to the outside world. So it's basically two ways of getting to the same point. I mean, the other thing about the free energy principle is it really licenses this strong connection between life and mind, because it goes right down into individual cells.
For sure. It would be like a self-evidencing zeroth axiom of
yes.
free energy principle.
Yes, Jacob Howie has written about it exactly in terms of self-evidencing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this was already a segue into the way our last two panels will unfold, with more of a dynamic approach in which we ask the panelists questions, and then we expect from them to give us wisdom. So one last round of applause for Anil Seth.